Hey guys, tonight we tumble head first, well, coat first, into one of the most quietly bizarre stories in history. Picture this: you're trudging through ankle-deep snow somewhere on the vast, frozen plains of Russia. It's 1812, and the wind is practically chewing holes through your uniform. You're part of Napoleon's Grande Army, and you've just realized the buttons on your greatcoat are snapping off from the cold. Frostbitten fingers fumble at brass discs now brittle with ice, and suddenly you wonder, did no one think this through? Spoiler, they didn't. And yet, out of this very chill came one of Napoleon's stranger legacies. Not a sweeping military reform or diplomatic treatise, but a button design. A button. Yes, a small, mostly circular piece of metal destined to hold coats closed and, apparently, historical mysteries open. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're tuning in from somewhere cozy, drop your location and the local time in the comments. Always curious to know who's lying under the covers in Melbourne or propped up on a sofa in Wisconsin. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You crouch slightly beneath your military issue coat, your breath curling in front of your face like steam from an impatient kettle. This is Russia in winter. It is not a place designed for human survival, unless you're covered in fur and have hooves. You glance down at your coat and notice one of your brass buttons, round, polished, small, dignified, has cracked clean off. And you're not alone. All around you, men are fiddling with ripped buttonholes and broken closures. It's like some cruel cosmic joke, except the punchline is hypothermia. Some try to tie their coats shut with string, others steal buttons off fallen comrades. Yes, even in death, your buttons aren't safe. Historians still argue whether Napoleon ever personally complained about his coat closures during the Russian campaign. But we do know this: uniform functionality mattered deeply to him. Not in the cuddly, let's keep the lads warm kind of way, more in the an army looks sharp, fights sharp doctrine. Napoleon famously believed in presentation. A man might be starving, but his collar better be crisp. And in a time where fashion was power, especially for military officers, the coat was more than just protection. It was messaging. The kind that said, I might die tomorrow, but I'll do it in matching epaulets. So yes, those buttons mattered. And while brass had the gleam of prestige, it was also a liability in cold climates. Metal shrinks in freezing conditions, and the shanks, the little necks that hold the button to the coat, would snap under pressure. Some even report buttons freezing to skin. Imagine trying to peel your greatcoat open and losing part of your chest hair in the process. Not ideal. It gets better, or weirder. Because this coat crisis didn't just inconvenience the soldiers. It sparked a minor fashion innovation spree. Military tailors, already working like caffeinated spiders, scrambled to redesign overcoats with tighter inner linings and alternative fastenings. There were experiments with wood, bone, and even tightly packed woolen knots as temporary button substitutes. Some were stylish. Most looked like a toddler's art project. And amid this freezing chaos, Napoleon, who was famously detail-oriented, allegedly called for a more resilient design. What did that mean? Well, scholars don't agree. Some say he simply demanded buttons be reinforced with leather washers. Others insist he personally sketched a spiral design, like a brass galaxy, meant to deflect cold and symbolically represent the empire's eternal reach. Admittedly, that last one sounds a bit dramatic. But hey, so was Napoleon. We do have a historical fact, though. Napoleon's uniforms began to feature rows of brass buttons that extended all the way up to the collar, with as many as 12 on each side. This wasn't just for aesthetics. The positioning may have been an early attempt at insulating the chest and neck more effectively, basically using buttons as a kind of thermal sealant. Let's not kid ourselves, it didn't work great. But it did lead to one unexpected legacy: copycats. Across Europe, officers from Prussia to Portugal began sporting similarly button-heavy coats. Not for warmth, but for bravado. The more buttons, the more intimidating you apparently looked on horseback. It was basically the 19th century version of having extra exhaust pipes on your car that do nothing. Now here's the quirky tidbit of the night. Some soldiers believe that buttons, when properly aligned, could act like a compass. There was this whole fringe belief that the brass would react subtly to magnetic north if you lay very, very still and shut your eyes. It obviously didn't work. But still, imagine lying there in your half-buttoned coat, whispering to your chest, "Take me home, shiny circle." Of course, as you sit here thinking about this odd little detail, you realize how something so tiny can spiral into an entire historical subplot. Napoleon's button was not just a button. It was an emblem, a design problem, a marketing choice, a logistical nightmare, and eventually, a collector's item. That's right. Today, there are collectors who specialize solely in Napoleonic buttons. They examine them under microscopes, comparing thread grooves, metal compositions, and even corrosion patterns. Some say it's a form of peaceful meditation. Others say it's a very expensive kind of boredom. And here's a final twist to think about as you rest your head. Some museums now display what they claim are Napoleon's own uniform buttons, but not a single one can be verified beyond doubt. No DNA swabs, no perfect provenance trail. Just educated guesses and a lot of velvet display cases. You lie back now, eyes heavier, the image of a tiny brass circle floating in your mind. Who knew something so small could carry so much unnecessary historical weight? You're standing in front of a long table cluttered with needles, thread, and bolts of heavy wool dyed a proper military blue. You can almost smell the mix of oil, wax, and faintly scorched fabric. Welcome to a French uniform workshop during the height of Napoleon's campaigns, where the sewing never stops, and where buttons are more than accessories. They're strategic assets. Tailors move like ghosts across the room, each hunched over a bit of fabric that will soon become the proud breast of an officer's greatcoat. You watch one craftsman lift a shiny brass button between two fingers, studying it like it might whisper military secrets. Then, with a deft twist of the wrist, he secures it to a thick lapel with waxed linen thread, reinforced with a neat little disc of leather behind the cloth. The button sits proudly, round and gleaming. You wouldn't think of this as battlefield prep, but that's what it is. For Napoleon, the war effort extended all the way to the tailor's bench. He believed discipline began with uniformity, and uniformity began with, well, actual uniforms. Rows of buttons weren't just for looks. They created a visual rhythm. An army lined up for inspection looked like a polished machine, all metal glints and symmetry. And that matters when your goal is to psychologically rattle your enemies before the shooting starts. Mainstream fact incoming. Napoleon's strict regulations on military attire were codified in the Règlement de l'Armée Française, the official army dress code. Officers were fined if their buttons were tarnished. Enlisted men had to polish theirs daily. Not metaphorically, actually polish them. With vinegar and a scrap of cloth. If a button was missing, it wasn't just a sewing mishap, it was insubordination. But here's where it gets interesting. The origin of Napoleon's obsession with buttons? Historians still argue whether it came from his early military training. He studied at a strict academy where even the placement of a cuff could be a disciplinary issue, or whether it developed later, as his ambitions grew and his need for order intensified. Either way, by the time he declared himself emperor, the French military was a walking, marching, brass-button fashion statement. Now let's talk logistics. Imagine trying to outfit hundreds of thousands of men, across multiple campaigns, in uniforms that matched. You think finding 2 matching socks in your drawer is tough? Multiply that by 1,000,000 feet. Napoleon's quartermasters dealt with button shortages so often, they kept emergency reserves, literal crates of spare buttons, in case of a sudden campaign. But not all buttons were created equal. Officers had theirs custom-made, often with tiny engraved eagles or the imperial insignia. Common soldiers? They got standard-issue buttons, mass-cast in dusty workshops from Grenoble to Lille. And then there were the knockoffs, cheap alloys that looked shiny enough when new, but turned green faster than old lettuce. Men would sometimes scrape the gunk off their buttons with knives, muttering that they'd been issued more chemistry experiment than uniform. Here's your quirky tidbit. Rumors swirled among the rank and file that licking your brass button could bring luck before battle. It supposedly woke up the metal, made it shine just right, or charmed your musket to fire straighter. Unsurprisingly, it didn't work. It did, however, give a lot of soldiers suspicious stomach cramps. Mystery solved. And now a subtle twist in our slow-motion coat saga. Some women were hired specifically to sew on buttons and only buttons. In large cities like Paris, there were entire sewing guilds that focused on this micro-task. Each woman could attach dozens in a day, often using her own homemade wax blend to strengthen the thread. One popular mixture included pine sap, a hint of crushed bay leaves, and brace yourself, onion peel. Why? No one knows. It smelled awful, but was said to hold like a soldier's promise. But not all efforts succeeded. When France invaded Egypt in 1798, the desert heat warped brass buttons so badly that entire coats would twist out of shape. Metal expanded, threads snapped, and soon jackets were flapping in the wind like sad flags. The desert campaign was already a logistical nightmare, but buttons? Apparently, even the climate had opinions on French fashion. And then there's the legendary tale, probably apocryphal, definitely weird, that Napoleon once halted a marching battalion to personally inspect their coats. As the story goes, he noticed one soldier's buttons were dusty. Not tarnished. Not missing. Just dusty. Napoleon supposedly shouted, "Your discipline reflects your buttons!" and fined the entire unit. Honestly? That sounds exactly like something he'd do. It also illustrates a broader point. In Napoleon's mind, the smallest parts were always connected to the biggest ideas. A coat button wasn't just functional. It was ideological. That's probably why his own personal tailors, yes, he had several, were treated almost like military advisors. One even wrote a long, rambling memoir that historians still comb through, mostly for the strange insights like, "His Majesty preferred his buttons warm before dressing." That's right. Napoleon liked warm buttons. Whether this was to avoid cold metal shocking his skin or simply a personal quirk, we'll never really know. But it's a delightful image, the Emperor of France, conqueror of Europe, standing with arms outstretched while a servant warms his coat buttons over a candle. As you imagine this scene, the rhythmic clink of buttons and scissors fades to a dull echo. You're lying flat now, just watching the light bounce off those tiny, circular tokens of military theater. Little brass suns stitched into fabric clouds. Shiny, proud, and destined to fall off at the worst moment. You're drifting now, just slightly, into the sound of distant marching boots, heel to toe, each one keeping time like a ticking clock made of leather and resolve. But in your hazy state you notice something odd. All these marching men, why are they all fiddling with their sleeves? It turns out, there's a story there, too. You see, Napoleon wasn't content to simply obsess over the number or shine of buttons. No, he needed to shape how soldiers interacted with their own uniforms. And this leads us to one of the strangest, and most debated, details of Napoleonic attire, the legendary brass sleeve buttons. These weren't just decorative. They had a purpose. Or they might have. Historians still argue whether Napoleon ordered brass buttons placed on sleeves, specifically on the cuffs, to stop soldiers from wiping their noses on their uniforms. Yes, you heard that right. The emperor may have declared war on sleeve sniffling. You imagine it now, rows of exhausted infantry, trudging through wind and sleet, their noses running like unchecked rivers. No tissues. No handkerchiefs. Just a sleeve and a dream. But then, ouch, those shiny brass buttons scrape across the skin like a prickly reminder. Your honor is on the line, soldier. Use your dignity, or at least a leaf. This theory, as amusing as it sounds, is grounded in some surprising practicality. In the early 1800s, military hygiene was almost non-existent. Illness spread rapidly through armies, and a simple cold could knock out entire units. So maybe, just maybe, those sleeve buttons were an early attempt at infection control. Brass has natural antimicrobial properties. though that's not something your average grenadier was pondering while sneezing into his elbow. Now, for a mainstream fact, those infamous cuff buttons weren't unique to Napoleon. Several European armies used similar designs, often as symbols of rank or regiment. But Napoleon's flair for standardization meant every French coat had them, from the lowliest infantrymen to high-ranking marshals. He even demanded they be placed at the same angle on each coat, so arms looked symmetrical while saluting. Still, the sneeze theory sticks. And the placement mattered. You notice how they're always just above the wrist. Not at the elbow, not scattered randomly. Just low enough to catch a dragging knuckle or wayward nose. It's so oddly specific that it makes the whole no nose wiping thing kind of plausible. Of course, not everyone believed this. Some tailors insisted the buttons were there to protect the cuffs from fraying. After all, marching through mud, loading muskets, and wrestling with firewood takes its toll on fabric. The buttons created a stiff edge that kept sleeves from wearing out too quickly. A button as wearable armor, charming in its own way. And then there's the decorative theory. Maybe the buttons were just meant to look good. Period fashion was all about detail, especially in military clothing. A cuff with 5 shiny brass dots practically screamed, "Behold my emperor's tailoring budget!" Quirky tidbit time. Soldiers gave nicknames to their sleeve buttons. One regiment called them "Little Guardians," while another referred to them as "Knuckle Biters." There's even a half-joking complaint in a letter from a grenadier to his cousin back home. "My buttons have taken more skin than the barber." No one said elegance came without cost. Meanwhile, the tailors back in Paris were living in a different reality. Button making had become an industry within itself, with craftsmen specializing only in finishing brass. They polished each one with a mix of vinegar and chalk powder, sometimes singing songs to keep rhythm. One such tune was affectionately titled, "Shine Bright, You Imperial P," which, if nothing else, deserves a comeback. These songs echoed through narrow workshops where young apprentices learned their trade under the unforgiving eyes of button masters. Yes, that was a real thing. You had to prove your worth before you could craft a uniform button fit for Napoleon's army. Drop one on the floor? That's a stern lecture. Put the wrong regiment's number on a button face? That's a formal reprimand, and possibly an existential crisis, depending on your level of sleep deprivation. Here's a strange one for you. Some scholars believe certain buttons were laced with scent. Perfumed brass, soaked in herbal oils. Not because soldiers were meant to smell good, please don't flatter them, but because aromatics like lavender and rosemary were thought to repel bad humors. A sort of wearable ward against plague and melancholy. Picture that, a sleeve button doubling as a tiny, clunky mood diffuser. And now for a twist you didn't expect, counterfeit buttons. Yep, that was a thing. As Napoleon's empire expanded, so did the demand for regulation-compliant uniforms. And where there's demand, there's forgery. Black market buttons popped up from Prague to Milan, often made from tin instead of brass. They looked decent from afar, but bent easily and tarnished overnight. Soldiers caught with these knockoffs could be reprimanded, or worse, accused of desertion, since mismatched gear hinted at stolen or scavenged clothing. So how did soldiers test the authenticity of their buttons? Well, some bit into them. Others tried the hot-cold test. Drop a button near a fire and see how fast it discolors. This didn't always go well, especially if your uniform was still on your body. As you sit there, watching a soldier absently rub his sleeve against a tree trunk, just trying to scrape some grime from a stubborn cuff, you wonder how many of these small habits outlived their empires. How many traditions, born from brass and sore knuckles, carried on just because no one thought to question them? The answer, it seems, is most of them. Even modern dress uniforms, centuries removed from Napoleon's battlefield, often include decorative buttons in rows along the cuff, completely non-functional but persistent. Like ghosts of old commands still whispering, "Stop touching your face, Pierre." And so you lean back again, letting the buttons clink softly in your mind. A faint golden sheen circles around your mental vision. Details no bigger than a coin, yet carrying the weight of an emperor's ego, a tailor's precision, and maybe, just maybe, a sniffle The firelight flickers as you sit in that dreamy tent again, watching a soldier gently trace the edges of his uniform's cuff. His fingers brush across the little brass nubs that have grown warm from the heat. But tonight, let's take a stroll away from those cuffs. Let's look at something just a little lower, because we're finally getting to the part about pants. Yes, Napoleonic trousers. And no, they weren't immune to the button craze either. You shuffle along the muddy row of canvas tents, weaving between snoozing soldiers and piles of boots, until you spot a young conscript adjusting his pant legs. His name might be Jean or Louis or maybe something grand like the feel, but all you notice are the dozen buttons trailing up his outer seam like a parade of polished beetles. They clink faintly as he shifts. That's right, Napoleon's soldiers didn't just button their jackets and cuffs. They buttoned their trousers, their gaiters, even the stirrups sewn into their pant hems. Functional? Sort of. Fashionable? Questionable. But mandatory? Absolutely. Mainstream historical fact here. The French army under Napoleon wore a regulation item called the pantalon de route, marching trousers that were tough, woolen, and unflattering in exactly the way you'd expect from 19th century military design. The buttons running up the outer thighs weren't just for flair. They were designed to be undone for easier dressing, especially over thick boots or bandaged legs. Soldiers could unbutton the outer seams instead of tugging their trousers down in one exhausting motion. Now those same buttons, once fastened, sat tight against the leg and created a sleek silhouette from hip to shin. Sleek, of course, being generous. The average soldier's silhouette was more potato sack meets discipline. But Napoleon liked his lines clean, on the battlefield and on the body. Presentation, after all, could win hearts even when supply lines couldn't. Quirky tidbit incoming. Some soldiers believed that unbuttoning the trousers fully on one leg brought bad luck before a march. Apparently, if you undressed too quickly, your soul might stumble along behind you, still tugging at the wool. So they only opened half the buttons. Oddly sweet, in a goosebumped kind of way. Back at camp, you watch one of the quartermasters examining a pair of trousers for missing fasteners. His toolkit includes a wax thread roll, a needle as long as your pinky, and you guessed it, a pouch of spare brass buttons sorted by unit. Some buttons bore small etched symbols, a cannon for artillery, a flaming grenade for grenadiers, and a curiously stylized eagle that looked, if you squinted, like a chicken in flight. The engraving quality depended on who made them. Royal suppliers? Gorgeous. Local blacksmith in a rush? Let's just say the eagle had a long day. This leads us to the debate. Did Napoleon actually care about these tiny design variations? Historians still argue whether he micromanaged the button engravings or left that to regional quartermasters. Some say he was too busy redrawing the map of Europe to obsess over insignia aesthetics. Others insist he gave explicit orders, down to the number of feathers on an embroidered eagle's wing. Either way, his legacy stuck, and these design standards echoed into other armies that modeled themselves on the French system. The truly strange part? The buttons themselves had fans, like collectors. Even then, some soldiers kept their favorite buttons as mementos. One guy reportedly wore a lucky button on a string around his neck, claiming it had deflected a saber strike during the Battle of Austerlitz. Historians are skeptical, but hey, every era has its lucky socks. And now for a moment with a civilian. Imagine you're walking through Paris, months before Napoleon launches another campaign. A mother is sewing brass buttons onto a pair of trousers for her teenage son, who's just joined the conscripts. Her fingers are red and callous, but she places each button with care, whispering small wishes into every stitch. Don't tear. Don't rust. Come back wearing all of them. You pause at that thought. So many of these little objects, touched, worn, polished, carried the weight of worry, not just war. To the soldiers, they were uniform. But to the families left behind, they were tiny anchors holding loved ones to memory. At the same time, in less sentimental corners of the empire, enterprising merchants were profiting handsomely off uniform accessories. Some even sold unofficial, enhanced buttons. These might be extra shiny, shaped slightly differently, or made from imitation gold. One scammy tailor claimed his custom button design increased marching efficiency by 11%. The math, naturally, was not peer-reviewed. Back on the march, let's not forget the poor soldiers who had to replace their own buttons. Not only was it tricky to thread a brass fastener onto stiff wool with numb fingers, but sewing in a straight line while sitting on a frozen log? That's practically its own form of military training. Some men bartered for replacement work, trading coffee, tobacco, or even spare shoe nails for a bit of needlework help from the regiments. Button whisperer, every camp had one. The debate over practicality flared up again decades later, when military historians analyzed battlefield letters and found repeated references to annoying leg buttons. Some theorized that if Napoleon had simply invented stretchy pants, he might have conquered Britain. That remains unproven. But here's another fun oddity. There were actually military songs about buttons. One went something like this, translated loosely. Brass on my wrist, brass down my knee. I march for the glory, and trip over me. Catchy. Slightly awkward in rhythm, but catchy. You close your eyes now and feel the soft wind brushing your own imagined pant cuffs, the gentle tap of a button grazing skin. Maybe it's decorative. Maybe it's a curse repeller. Maybe it's a mother's last stitch. But you start to see what they saw. These tiny things held together more than just clothing. They held a whole empire in place, one fastener at a time. You're still seated near the campfire, the embers now dimming into a smoldering glow. Somewhere nearby, a bugle winds out a sleepy tune, half-hearted and flat. You glance down at your boots, not real boots, but imaginary ones, dusted with dream dirt, and notice that, of course, they're buttoned too. Because nothing in Napoleon's army escaped the tyranny of the button. Tonight you shuffle toward the subject of military boots, specifically, the role buttons played in holding them together. You might not expect footwear to come with so much fastener flair, but Napoleonic shoewear was more complicated than it had any right to be. Blame the mud. Blame the marching. Or just blame the fashion sense of a man who liked structure so much, he once reorganized an entire empire just to have neater maps. First, a quick boot fact. Napoleon's troops were issued two standard footwear types: short ankle boots called souliers for regular wear, and taller bottes for cavalry or officers. The higher up you were in rank, the more ridiculous your boots became. Officers' boots climbed halfway up the calf and often came with multiple flaps, seams, or yes, rows of tiny, shiny buttons that had zero business being out in the wilderness but looked oh so proper while riding a horse. The mainstream historical fact here: most soldiers wore hobnailed leather boots without left or right foot distinction. That's right, both shoes were identical. No arch support, no fancy soles, no breaking in curve. You just mashed them onto your feet and hoped they'd eventually mold to resemble human anatomy. Spoiler, they usually didn't. And still, some were secured with a loop of leather fastened by, you guessed it, a side button. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some of the buttons used on boots were actually made of compressed paper pulp. Not very water-resistant, but cheap and surprisingly strong, until it rained. In soggy terrain, the buttons would swell, disintegrate, or fuse to the fabric in a kind of footsog sculpture. More than one soldier had to cut their boots off with a bayonet, like unwrapping a papier-mâché foot burrito. Even worse, there were occasional instances where frostbitten feet froze to their own buttons, creating little brass polka dots of pain. Field surgeons kept warm water on hand, not just for wounds, but for gently prying soldiers out of their fashionable foot prisons. Cozy, right? And now, a debate that still marches on. Historians still argue whether button-fastened boots were a logistical failure or a minor aesthetic indulgence. Some records say buttons were phased out of infantry boots early in the wars due to complaints and breakages. Others argue that plenty of regiments stubbornly clung to button side panels well into the Russian campaign, where they reportedly shattered from cold like tiny brass icicles. Let's say you're trudging through the Alps. It's 1800. Napoleon's crossing the Great St. Bernard Pass. It's freezing, your boots leak, and you've got ice forming along your lashes. And just as you think it can't get worse, one of your boot buttons pops off and vanishes into the snow. You spend 10 minutes poking through slush to find it, not because you care, but because your sergeant will have opinions if you show up missing hardware. But even in misery, the boot button had defenders. Some officers swore it gave the footwear a snugger fit, reducing ankle injuries on long marches. Others claimed it was harder for thieves to steal your boots while you slept, because nothing ruins a nap like waking up barefoot in Austria. Back in Paris, meanwhile, cobblers working for the imperial quartermasters developed little toolkits for traveling officers. These kits included button spares, thread, wax, a curved needle, and a button hook, not unlike the Victorian ones that would come later. Napoleon himself was rumored to carry one in his baggage train, nestled between spare gloves and his signature gray coat. True? Who knows? But it's charming to imagine the most feared general in Europe quietly darning a boot button after lights out. Oh, and here's a bizarre side note. Boot buttons were sometimes used as tokens in makeshift soldier gambling games. You'd bet with brass buttons instead of coins, since actual currency was scarce and heavy. One game was called La Chute, a mix of dice and rock paper scissors, where the loser had to surrender a boot button. Some unlucky gamblers limped around half-fastened for days, rattling with every step like clunky percussionists. Even civilians weren't immune. Fashionable ladies of the empire occasionally wore boots modeled after cavalry styles, complete with decorative side buttons, sometimes made of enamel or mother-of-pearl. There's even a painting of Empress Josephine in riding boots that appear to have about 16 unnecessary buttons, most of them fastened so tightly you could bounce a coin off her calf. Practical? Absolutely not. But on brand? Definitely. By now, your imaginary feet are aching just thinking about all this. But wait, one more oddball entry from the archive. A field report from 1807 details a Polish soldier who modified his boots using custom wooden buttons carved from pipe stems. The buttons were carved with little faces, one smiling, one frowning. Superstitious soldiers believed that depending on which face you fastened first, your day would go well, or terribly. It's unclear if the man survived the war, but his boots certainly made it into a museum, and people still stop to stare at them with quiet wonder. The takeaway? Napoleon didn't just command armies, he indirectly oversaw a continent-wide button economy. Footwear might seem like the least glamorous part of a uniform, but it's often the first to fail and the hardest to replace. So buttons, those tiny circles of brass and bone, were more than decoration. They were security, status, and superstition all wrapped around a pair of sore heels. As the wind grows colder and the fire flickers lower, you wrap your cloak tighter, your boots imaginary but somehow heavy. You glance down once more, counting the buttons that remain intact, and smile. Still in regulation. Still marching. The fire's burned down to its last coals now, just enough glow to see your fingers move. You trace the curve of a coat sleeve, follow it up to the shoulder, where yet another button glints softly in the darkness. It's endless, isn't it? Buttons for boots, buttons for sleeves, buttons for, well, for making a statement. And if Napoleon loved one thing almost as much as winning battles, it was making a very loud, very shiny, very tailored statement. Tonight we button up the discussion with jackets, military coats to be exact. And trust me, we're not talking fleece zip-ups or windbreakers. These were full theatrical productions stitched onto a human torso. Rows of buttons marched across chest panels like miniature battalions, gleaming and redundant and heavy enough to drag you forward if you lean just slightly too far. Start with this mainstream historical fact. The French military jacket of the Napoleonic era, often called a habit vest, was a tight-fitting, double-breasted garment made of heavy wool. The buttons weren't just for closing it, they were code. How many buttons, how they were arranged, even what insignia they bore, these told you everything: rank, regiment, sometimes even your military branch. Like little metallic business cards, but colder and harder to swallow. And swallow you did. Some soldiers reportedly lost buttons in battle and popped them into their mouths to avoid being disciplined. Which feels dramatic, until you realize that buttons were regulated military property. Lose too many, and it was like showing up out of uniform. And out of uniform meant standing out, which in Napoleon's army could be worse than actual wounds. Here's your quirky tidbit. Jacket buttons were sometimes melted down and recast when regiments were disbanded. A single battalion could leave behind hundreds of orphan buttons, some of which were collected, sorted, and recycled into commemorative items. One Parisian button maker even crafted snuff boxes out of them. Imagine coughing your lungs out into a finely decorated tin that once fastened someone's elbow. Chic and vaguely cursed. But now let's talk mystery. Historians still argue whether Napoleon personally approved every uniform design, or if he simply set the overall aesthetic tone and let his tailors take over. Some surviving correspondence shows him commenting on epaulette placement and color schemes. But whether he sat down and said, "No, Jacques, I want exactly 10 buttons down the left and 5 fake ones on the right," remains, well, debatable. It's the kind of historical question that no one will probably ever answer, but scholars still love to argue about it at conferences over weak espresso. Imagine you're in the uniform depot outside Lyon. You've just been issued your regulation blue coat. It's stiff, freshly dyed, and already smells faintly of boiled onions and glue. You slide it on, feel the tightness in your chest, and start the buttoning process. 1, 2, 3, 4, there's no rushing this. The buttons are domed, slippery, and spaced so awkwardly you need to twist your arm like a circus contortionist just to close the middle one. You do eventually manage, of course. But not before your bunkmate mutters something unprintable about fashion over function. And really, they're not wrong. These coats weren't exactly designed for comfort, or movement, or surviving a winter in Russia, for that matter. But they looked phenomenal in oil paintings. Here's a visual joke your modern brain will appreciate. One regimental style included purely decorative button rows on the back of the coat. That's right, buttons you couldn't reach, couldn't use, and couldn't even see. Why were they there? To make sure your coat tails lay properly, and to drive you slowly mad while trying to lean back in a chair without bruising your spine on brass nubs. Still, there was pride in the look. Soldiers compared buttons like sports fans compare jersey stats. "Ah, yes, but mine are embossed with the imperial eagle," you'd hear someone boast, as though anyone could tell from more than 2 feet away. And like trading cards, rare or out-of-production buttons sometimes changed hands privately, passed down like lucky charms or silent trophies. Then there was the tailoring. Jackets had to be snug, very snug. Too much slack made you look slovenly. Too little, and you couldn't breathe properly. A soldier might lose or gain weight and suddenly find his coat rendered completely useless. Adjusting it wasn't as easy as grabbing new off the rack. Tailors used a mix of darting, pleating, and button shifting to resize a uniform. A skilled military tailor could move a button 2 centimeters and make you look 10 pounds slimmer. Eat your heart out, Instagram filters. And in battle? Buttons could, and did, catch saber slashes, musket straps, and occasionally enemy bayonets. Some men swore their buttons saved their lives, deflecting blows that might have gone deeper. Others blamed buttons for getting them snagged mid-run, turning them into very fashionable targets. Either way, buttons were part of the risk. And there's one last oddity worth sharing. Napoleon had a known preference for asymmetry in his own garments. Several of his surviving coats have uneven button patterns, 4 on one lapel, 5 on the other. Was it a fashion choice? A tailor's mistake? A way to throw enemies off balance? Historians have no clue, and the theories range from "he liked how it looked" to "he thought even numbers were unlucky." You get to pick whichever one makes you smile sleepily. Your coat is fastened now, fully buttoned, shoulders squared. You feel the weight of rank, the strangeness of style, and maybe just a hint of pride. It's ridiculous. It's uncomfortable. But somehow, you look the part. The night's quiet again. Somewhere, a fox trots through the underbrush, ignoring you completely. You shift slightly, the brass buttons on your back pressing into the imaginary log you've chosen for a seat. You don't move. It's part of the look. You're already 10 buttons deep into this fantasy uniform, shoulders hugged by the stiff wool of history. But let's roll the focus down now, to your waist. Because what is a good coat without a belt? And more importantly, what did Napoleon's officers and foot soldiers stash in those belts and pouches while trudging across Europe like very dramatic, underfed models on a runway from hell? The military belt, or ceinturon, wasn't just for cinching. It was a portable life system. You wore your essentials here, not too different from the modern dad with his suspiciously over-equipped fanny pack, except this one included bullets and a fork instead of wet wipes and breath mints. Let's start with a mainstream historical fact. The typical French infantryman carried a cartridge box, sometimes leather-bound and embossed with his regiment's insignia, attached to a belt slung over one shoulder. This bandolier-style carry wasn't just practical, it helped distribute the weight, something very important when you're also lugging a musket, a backpack, a canteen, and the world's most hostile attitude. But oh, the belt could hold so much more. Personal items were tucked into various nooks and crannies. A flint for starting fires. A wooden spoon. A little pouch of dried lentils, because yes, even on the battlefield, fiber matters. Some men even carried tiny mirrors, not for vanity but for sending signals or checking their teeth for battlefield spinach. Priorities. Now here's a quirky tidbit. At least a few soldiers sewed small pockets on the inside of their belts to carry love tokens. Lockets, letters, the occasional dried flower, sweet, sad reminders of someone probably back in a small French village who never once imagined their boutonniere would travel all the way to Prussia and back. One account describes a button-shaped charm filled with perfumed oil. Yes, buttons again. Apparently, we can't escape them. It's Napoleon's universe. We're just accessorizing in it. And of course, no conversation about military belts is complete without mentioning the giberne, a hard leather cartridge box often worn at the back, held by the shoulder belt and sometimes decorated with brass insignia or even velvet lining, for officers with taste and back problems. Some versions had tiny compartments for extra flints or cleaning tools, like the Swiss Army knives of the 19th century, but louder and likely to explode if you dropped them. There's debate, naturally. Historians still argue whether French soldiers consistently packed standardized gear or if personal customization was quietly tolerated in the ranks. Official regulations were clear, but then again, soldiers are people. And people get creative when they're cold, hungry, and marching through muddy fields wearing 20 pounds of wool and regret. Sketches from the era show all sorts of liberties, makeshift bags, odd trinkets, patched-up belts. Some officers frowned on it. Others didn't notice, too busy perfecting their sideburn angles. Let's walk in those boots for a second. Imagine reaching for your belt pouch as dusk settles on a frostbitten plain. You fumble past the cartridge box and pull out a crust of stale bread, your dinner and breakfast, probably. There's also a small glass vial that clinks gently, tucked in its own pouch. What is it? Medicinal brandy, allegedly. But let's be honest, it's for morale. Near the back, you find a slender wood-handled knife, sharpened down to a toothpick from years of use. It's engraved with something. Maybe your name, maybe someone else's. Hard to tell anymore. You keep it close. In a world of unreliable supply chains and surprise cavalry charges, a good knife feels like a blessing. Jokes aside, yes, we're allowed a few even in wartime. It's kind of wild how personal these belts became. You'd think armies would enforce strict minimalism. But the belt wasn't just function, it was identity. Your belt told your story. Your habits. Your needs. Your oddities. A few soldiers were even known to keep dried fruit tucked into secret belt folds, sometimes smuggled from home or bartered from passing traders. One infamous grenadier apparently insisted on traveling with a belt pouch filled only with pickled garlic cloves. His tent mates hated it. His enemies probably did too. Now pause. Zoom out. You're wearing this belt. You've got a flint, a spoon, a letter from someone named Marguerite who never doubts her, I.S., and enough hard biscuits to either feed a rat or kill one with blunt force. The belt cuts a little into your hips when you bend, but you adjust it. It's familiar. It's yours. You've walked 100 miles with this thing bouncing on your thigh. And somehow, it's become part of you. But there's elegance, too. Officers' belts weren't just practical, they were ceremonial. embellished with embroidery, metal trim, ornate clasps. Some even had elaborate closures that required both hands and a minor degree in mechanical engineering to undo. Because clearly what you want during a surprise enemy ambush is a 12-second struggle with your belt buckle. Among the more eccentric trends, a few high-ranking officials had hidden compartments sewn into the inner lining of their sashes. Think of it like a Napoleonic money belt, but for love notes and emergency snuff. One overly prepared general reportedly carried a small collapsible spoon, a tiny comb, and a rolled-up map inside his. Honestly, you could build a sitcom around that belt. By nightfall, you rest on your bedroll, or the nearest dry patch of grass, and remove your belt last. It thunks softly to the ground, oddly satisfying. You give it a little pat, like you're telling it, "Good job," because it really has done the work. Marched miles. Held rations. Smuggled chocolate. Survived more weather than your uncle's fishing vest. And as your eyelids droop, you think, not of battle or glory, but of that tiny hidden mirror in the belt. It catches a glint of moonlight. Maybe you glimpse your reflection. Maybe you don't. Either way, it's quiet. The belt has nothing left to carry for now. Just you. You're drifting now, softly nestled in layers of linen and wool, belt off, buttons unbuttoned, and maybe, just maybe, your feet still aching from 1,000 metaphorical kilometers of marching. But now, lift your eyes toward the horizon, because next up is your travel companion. Not a loyal warhorse. Not a fellow soldier. No, your absolute ride or die is your baggage mule. Yes, the humble mule. Underappreciated, overworked, and basically the four-legged U-Haul of the Napoleonic army. With hooves. Picture it, a shaggy, grumpy creature with a comically oversized pack saddle, wobbling down a rutted road that barely qualifies as a road at all. You lead it by a frayed rope, but let's be honest, the mule's in charge. Always has been. Historically, armies relied heavily on beasts of burden, and Napoleon's forces were no exception. Mules, more than horses, were the preferred choice for transporting baggage over uneven terrain. They're stronger pound for pound, more sure-footed, and frankly less dramatic than horses. Horses panic. Mules just judge you. The average baggage mule carried up to 200 pounds. That's your tent canvas, mess kit, spare boots, maybe even some luxury items if you were lucky, or corrupt. French officers were known to sneak all sorts of contraband into their mules' saddlebags. Bottles of brandy. Silk shirts. There's even one recorded instance of a traveling chess set. Because nothing says, "I'm better than you," like casually playing chess during a siege. Quirky tidbit for you. During the retreat from Russia in 1812, some mules were dressed in spare uniforms to confuse the enemy at a distance. Were they effective decoys? Not even a little. Did it amuse the soldiers and maybe make some Russian scouts go, "Wait, are those goat-legged soldiers?" Absolutely. Now, the mule's gear was as specialized as yours. A wooden frame pack saddle cushioned with straw or wool, strapped tight with leather cinches. On either side hung canvas panniers or woven baskets packed with everything from grain to spare musket parts. And occasionally, when no one was looking, a wheel of contraband cheese. Because you never know when morale will dip, and cheese fixes everything. But it wasn't just your mule. A single regiment could have dozens, forming a caravan that stretched behind the troops like a slow-moving parade of stubborn clop-cloppers. These mule trains were guarded, managed, and occasionally, when things went sour, sacrificed. Harsh, yes. War doesn't leave room for sentiment. Unless you're French, in which case there's always room for sentiment and a tragic violin solo. Historians still argue whether Napoleon over-relied on these animal caravans or whether his logistical genius actually made them indispensable. After all, moving an army of tens of thousands required coordination most rulers couldn't dream of. But mules have limits. They tire. They protest. They sit down in the mud and refuse to budge, a behavior the French dubbed with something that roughly translates to la pause dramatique. And let's talk about mule drivers, muleteers. These guys were characters. Usually locals, often conscripted, always a little off. Some wore talismans for protection. Others sang to their animals. And a few were known to stage fake arguments with their mules, just to stay awake during long night marches. "No, Maurice, I told you we're not stopping. I don't care if you saw a ghost." One fringe account from a lesser-known regiment tells of a mule who allegedly refused to cross a particular bridge unless someone walked ahead singing. So a rotating schedule of singing soldiers was established, each taking turns crooning lullabies or tavern songs while tiptoeing across planks. Did it work? Who knows? But the mule made it to the other side, and that's what counts. You're walking again now, beside your own trusty mule. Let's call him Bertrand. His ears twitch. He snorts dramatically. He steps over a puddle with the precision of a ballerina and the attitude of a cat forced to wear boots. You pat his side, feeling the warmth beneath the rough hair. His panniers clink gently. Inside, some spare socks, your last dry shirt, and that one fork you refused to eat without. Now, feel the rhythm. Step clop, step clop. Bertrand's gait syncs with yours. The wind picks up a little. The sky bruises with dusk. You both know how far you've come, and how far you have left to go. There's something almost sacred in the bond between soldier and mule. You don't ride Bertrand, that would be disrespectful. He carries your burden, literally. He tolerates your complaints. And if you feed him the occasional apple core, he'll forgive your terrible singing. Of course, not everyone had a mule. Privates usually carried their own gear. But officers? They got the deluxe pack animal treatment. One marshal allegedly had 3 mules, one for essentials, one for comfort items, and one solely for books. Yes, an entire mule assigned to his reading habit. Because nothing says Napoleonic warfare like hauling 30 volumes of Voltaire into the Alps. Night comes fast out here. You tether Bertrand near a tree and give him a biscuit. He pretends not to like it but chews it anyway, begrudgingly. You lay out your roll nearby. The stars wink into view. Bertrand shifts, settling his weight. You swear you hear him sigh. And here's the kicker, sometimes the mules would save lives. Their weight and warmth acted as windbreakers during snowstorms. Soldiers curled up beside them, seeking shelter against howling Siberian winds. There are reports of soldiers sharing their rations with these animals, not out of duty, but affection. Because after weeks on the road, after rain and cold and so much marching, your mule wasn't just baggage transport. He was your rhythm, your heat source, your slightly moody therapist with hooves. So tonight, as you lie back, arms folded behind your head, coat pulled tight, you glance toward Bertrand. He's still awake, ears flicking lazily, probably judging you. That's okay. He's earned it. You wake before the sun, that bone-deep ache of sleeping on uneven ground keeping you honest. Your limbs feel like they've been folded and tucked by a particularly cruel origami artist. But Bertrand's already up, munching dry grass like it owes him money. A snort from him is your alarm clock. And your first task? Breakfast. Not yours. His. Because if you think you get cranky without food, try a mule with low blood sugar and centuries of evolutionary stubbornness. But eventually you do eat. And here's where things get interesting. What, exactly, did a Napoleonic soldier eat? And more importantly, what did they pack to eat? Meals on the march weren't candlelit affairs. No foie gras or macarons. Your culinary world is ruled by whatever you can carry, trade, scavenge, or boil until vaguely edible. French military rations were famously unpredictable. Bread, salt pork, dried peas, sometimes rice. Always hard, always bland, and if it wasn't stale by day 3, you were suspicious. Still, bread was your holy grail. The French army marched on it, crusty wheels or long loaves stashed awkwardly in your haversack. Some historians argue whether these loaves were actually baked hard on purpose, to last longer and double as impromptu shields. One private reportedly used his bread to block a stray bullet. Yes, it shattered. But so did the bullet. Who needs Kevlar when you have week-old pain militaire? Now, dried meat was also a staple, usually salted pork or beef, hard as roof shingles and just as chewable. You soak it first if there's water. If not, well, you gnaw until your teeth either win or surrender. Fringe accounts mention soldiers comparing pork slices by the number of missing teeth required to consume them. Only 3 molars? Luxury. For cooking, you've got your trusty mess tin, like a metallic lunchbox with a handle. You can boil, fry, or pretend to. Add water, toss in some dried peas, maybe some crumbled bread. Boom, wartime stew. Is it good? No. Does it fill your stomach and silence your complaining intestines? Usually. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some French officers pack spice sachets. Tiny cloth bundles of thyme, bay leaf, or even cinnamon. Not for luxury. Well, okay, a little for luxury, but to mask the flavor of questionable meat. One marshal was said to carry nutmeg like a lucky charm. Did it improve flavor or just morale? Historians still argue whether the psychological effect of seasoning was stronger than the physical. And what about water? Canteens were carried on straps, sloshing dully against your hip. You'd refill at streams, wells, or from the murky bottom of a wagon barrel. Purification tablets? Oh, sweet summer child, those are centuries away. Instead, you trust to your immune system, or more realistically, you get sick and learn to boil. Sometimes. Wine, though, is a different story. French soldiers were famously issued wine when possible, rationed carefully in leather flasks or small casks. A watered-down red might be the highlight of your day. It made the peas softer, the bread tolerable, and your commanding officer briefly tolerable. You're walking again, bread lumped into your shoulder bag, chewing slowly, like a tired cow trying to remember what joy used to taste like. Bertrand trudges beside you, eyes half-lidded like he, too, is unimpressed by breakfast. You consider sharing. He nibbles it from your palm. Maybe it's a bonding moment. Or maybe he's just hungry. Another culinary oddity, soldiers sometimes packed bouillon cubes, primitive ones anyway. Not the shiny store-bought kind, but bricks of concentrated broth, boiled down and dried into tough little pucks. Drop it into boiling water and pretend you're at a cafe. Except there's a musket across your lap and the waiter is a fellow soldier coughing from trench foot. And sweets? Rare. But not impossible. Some officers packed honey or sugar cubes. One eccentric lieutenant allegedly carried licorice root, chewing it absently during long rides. An herbalist's tradition, maybe. Or maybe he just had a sweet tooth and really good dental genes. Cooking fires were discouraged during stealth marches, but where possible, soldiers would gather twigs, light small fires, and take turns guarding the flame. Entire friendships were forged over poorly seasoned stew. You learned who was a decent cook and who should never be trusted with anything more complex than boiling water. A poorly salted pot might start a fistfight, or at least a strongly worded complaint. One debate among scholars is whether food discipline, the rationing, preparation, and distribution, was Napoleon's secret weapon. He understood morale better than most, and a fed soldier is a functional soldier. But the question remains, did his logistical chains stretch too thin trying to keep stomachs full? You're approaching a stream now. Clear, cold, and full of suspicious frogs. You dip your tin, letting the water swirl. Bertrand drinks beside you, tail twitching lazily. Around you, others refill canteens. A few try to wash their shirts. The results are underwhelming. The camp smells of smoke and boiled meat. A private with a broken shoe is toasting a slice of bread over a fire using his bayonet as a skewer. It's a strangely poetic sight, war and toast coexisting. You sit on a stump and chew your portion slowly, half asleep. The bread's still tough, but it's warm now. That helps. Food becomes ritual. A moment of stillness in chaos. You mark your day by it, morning crusts, midday stew, nightfall sips of wine. It grounds you. It keeps you human. And yet, despite the simplicity, there's pride in it. Soldiers traded recipes, bragged about their stew tactics, swore by weird combinations. No, if you crush the dried peas first, it thickens better. You added what to your rice? Okay, but you haven't lived until you've fried salt pork and leftover candle wax. The culinary creativity of boredom knows no bounds. Some even fashioned tiny ovens from bricks and fire embers, just to bake something, anything, resembling fresh bread. One unit was mocked for their camp tartlets, made of army biscuit and wild berries. But mockery tastes better than envy, and those tartlets were the envy of the camp. Probably. So tonight, when the stars reappear and Bertrand's belly is full and the stew pot is scraped clean, you lie back on your blanket with that final crust of bread tucked under your coat. Not for warmth. For tomorrow. Because in this world, bread is more than food. It's comfort, currency, armor, and possibly the hardest object in the known universe. The dawn's just a whisper on the horizon when you pull on your boots again, that familiar weight of your pack settling in like an old, cranky companion. You might think, well, it can't get much heavier. But then you remember the extra button kit Napoleon insisted on carrying, the one we're getting to soon, promise, and suddenly your shoulders grumble louder than Bertrand's stomach ever will. Speaking of buttons, the way soldiers handled their uniforms was a whole other saga, stitched tight with pride, superstition, and yes, more than a few fashion disasters. Napoleon wasn't just a general, he was a style icon of his day, whether he wanted to be or not. His preference for certain button designs wasn't just about looking sharp, it was a tactical and symbolic choice. Buttons on your uniform were the difference between rank and chaos. And Napoleon, obsessed with order, had very particular ideas about what his soldiers should wear. He favored brass buttons stamped with his emblem, eagles or bees, symbols of imperial power. Soldiers would polish these buttons relentlessly, turning their coats into gleaming beacons of authority. You probably didn't survive the army long if your buttons were missing or dull. Discipline wasn't just drilled into you, it shone from every shiny button. There's a quirky fact that often gets overlooked. Some soldiers believed their buttons carried luck. A missing button? Bad omen. A button that popped off mid-battle? Catastrophe. Some even sewed secret coins behind their buttonholes, hoping to carry fortune right into the fray. You can imagine the chaos when a tailor's apprentice accidentally mixed up button designs between regiments. Historians still argue whether it was a morale killer or a hilarious mix-up that soldiers joked about for months. Buttons were more than decoration, they were status markers, storytelling devices. The button design could signal your unit, your rank, your allegiance. And if you had Napoleon's favorite button style? Well, that was like wearing the emperor's personal stamp of approval. But here's the twist, Napoleon's favorite design wasn't the fanciest or most elaborate. It was surprisingly simple, reflecting his practical mindset. He preferred a small, round brass button with a discreet bee motif. Bees symbolized hard work and unity, a perfect emblem for his tightly disciplined troops. And why bees? They buzzed throughout French symbolism, representing industriousness and loyalty, qualities Napoleon wanted to glue into every soldier's heart. It's a little strange, you think, that a tiny button could carry so much meaning, yet here you are, staring at your coat, your fingers tracing the brass emblem that's outlasted bullets, mud, and the odd dinner crumb. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's button choice was a brilliant psychological tool, or just a personal quirk he never bothered to change. The button's durability was also practical. Brass resisted corrosion better than iron, which meant fewer replacements in the mud and rain-soaked trenches. Buttons weren't just functional, they were enduring, like a soldier's resolve. Now, for the fringe tidbit, rumors swirl that Napoleon once had buttons made from melted-down coins seized from enemy treasuries. A bit theatrical, sure, but it fed into the mythos of buttons as trophies, badges of conquest worn literally on your sleeve. Whether true or not, it's a story that made soldiers imagine their uniforms humming with the power of victory. You adjust your coat, the brass buttons gleaming faintly in the early light. That little shimmer is a silent promise of order in the chaos, a tiny beacon of empire. Bertrand snorts beside you, less impressed by button symbolism, more interested in breakfast, but even he seems to acknowledge the power hidden in those small metal discs. Uniforms are a language all their own, and Napoleon's buttons? Well, they speak louder than any shouted command. They remind you that even in the darkest moments, details matter. Because sometimes it's the little things, like a favorite button design, that hold an empire together. The morning haze begins to thin, and as you trudge onward, your mind drifts to the essentials tucked inside your satchel. Soldiers on the march had to pack light but smart, a balance between survival and practicality that could mean the difference between making it to camp or becoming just another forgotten footprint on the dirt road. Food, you'd expect, takes priority. Hardtack biscuits that tasted like cardboard but lasted forever, salted meat to stave off hunger, and sometimes a piece of dried fruit if you were lucky, or if your supply officer had a sense of mercy. You chew thoughtfully on one such biscuit now, gritty and dry enough to scrub your teeth but undeniably sustaining. What's fascinating is the variety of survival gear tucked away beyond the edible basics. A small whetstone to keep your bayonet sharp, because dull blades won't win battles, or impress anyone. You find yourself admiring the craftsmanship of the little tools you carry, as much as you dread the work ahead. Napoleonic soldiers often carried a small sewing kit, complete with needles and thread, hidden beneath layers of cloth. The ability to mend torn uniforms or patch gear mid-march was essential. A well-sewn button could be the difference between pride and humiliation, or worse, a uniform unfit for inspection. There's a fringe theory that some soldiers carried tiny bottles of perfume or scented oils, not for vanity but to mask the smell of sweat and campfires. Considering the long journeys through mud, rain, and endless days of exertion, it's not hard to imagine that a whiff of lavender or rosemary might have been a small comfort. Whether this was widespread or just the privileged few is still a topic historians debate. After all, odor control doesn't usually make the official army manuals. You wipe your brow and rummage in your bag for your favorite little possession, a folded piece of parchment with a prayer or poem, carried for luck or to steady nerves. Religion and superstition blended seamlessly in the soldiers' daily lives. Some carried tiny charms or talismans tucked beneath their coats, passed down from home or secretly exchanged among comrades. It's an intimate detail that reminds you these men were more than warriors. They were people clinging to hope in the face of uncertainty. Then there's the odd little item no one expected, a small handful of tobacco leaves or a pipe. Smoking was a common pastime and a rare luxury on long campaigns. It soothed nerves and brought a moment of camaraderie during breaks. Imagine lighting up under a starry sky after a day of marching, smoke curling upward like a soft whisper against the chill night air. That image feels timeless. Historians still argue whether certain items were standard issue or personalized by soldiers as a form of quiet rebellion or self-expression. After all, the military machine loved conformity, but individuality found a way to sneak in, through a button here, a charm there, or a secret note tucked inside a coat. You pat the side of your pack, grateful for the few comforts you've managed to carry. Every item tells a story, whether practical or sentimental, and together they build the invisible armor that keeps a soldier going far beyond muscle and metal. The sun climbs higher, casting long shadows that stretch lazily over the fields as you keep your pace steady. Your thoughts drift to the practical challenges of life on the road, the constant battle against the elements. Rain, mud, and cold could break a soldier's spirit faster than any enemy sword. Keeping dry was a struggle of its own, and so your gear included makeshift rain protection, oilcloth capes or simple tarps, sometimes just layers of thick wool. You learn quickly that staying dry isn't a luxury, it's a strategy for survival. Wet clothes mean sickness, and sickness means you might never see home again. There's an odd quirk in the history of soldier gear here. Some troops would carry handfuls of dried grass or leaves, stuffing them inside boots or cloaks as insulation. It sounds more like a campfire trick than military discipline, but it worked. Historians still debate whether this was officially encouraged or just a clever improvisation born out of necessity. Either way, you find yourself considering the idea of grass-lined boots, a rustic solution to an age-old problem, as you squish through muddy paths. Food preservation was another concern. Beyond the hardtack and salted meat, some soldiers carried simple tools to make the occasional fresh meal possible. A small iron pot or kettle could be slung over a fire for brewing tea or cooking whatever scraps were foraged. The ritual of boiling water and sipping warm tea was more than just comfort. It was a moment of peace amidst the chaos, a brief pause to gather strength. One fringe tale suggests that some soldiers carried tiny jars of honey, not just for sweetness but for medicinal purposes. Honey's natural antibacterial qualities made it a useful remedy for wounds or sore throats. It's easy to picture a weary soldier dipping a finger into a small pot of golden honey by firelight, a sticky but sweet reprieve. Whether this practice was widespread or anecdotal remains a point of scholarly discussion. Among the practical items, you also find personal mementos, a locket with a faded portrait, a pressed flower from a loved one, or a small carved token. These small treasures kept spirits alive and memories close. The harsh reality of war didn't erase the human need for connection and hope, even if that hope came wrapped in a tiny piece of carved wood. Now, about your coat. Remember Napoleon's favorite buttons? The care you put into your uniform mirrors the care you put into your survival kit. Everything has a place, a purpose. And sometimes, the most unexpected items, like dried grass or a jar of honey, can make all the difference between enduring the day or collapsing at night. As the sun warms your back, you feel the reassuring weight of your pack, each item a silent promise to keep you moving forward, one step at a time. The afternoon haze thickens as you trudge on, your thoughts turning to the essential yet often overlooked tools of communication on the march. Without cell phones or radios, soldiers relied on a surprisingly sophisticated system of signals and messengers to coordinate movements, issue commands, and warn of danger. Your pack holds small flags, whistles, and even coded notes tucked safely away, each item a lifeline in the chaotic dance of battle and travel. Whistles, simple as they seem, were vital for cutting through the noise of clashing swords and barking orders. A sharp blast could rally troops, signal retreat, or summon aid. Flags worked much the same way. A flick of red or white cloth could send messages across hundreds of yards, a silent conversation unfolding amid the din. You imagine standing on a dusty hill, waving a bright signal as your comrades respond in kind, the invisible thread of order weaving through the chaos. There's a curious detail many don't expect. Some soldiers carried tiny mirrors or polished metal discs to flash sunlight as a form of Morse-like communication. It's an ingenious, if somewhat precarious, method that required just the right angle and clear skies. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was, but its very existence speaks to the creativity soldiers had to employ when resources were scarce. Then there's the written word. Letters and notes, precious lifelines to home. These could be anything from heartfelt farewells to coded instructions. You carry a small notebook, its pages filled with scribbles and sketches, a blend of orders and personal musings. Writing was both practical and emotional, a way to anchor oneself amid the swirling uncertainty. One fringe theory suggests some soldiers developed their own secret codes, cryptic shorthand passed quietly among trusted comrades. Whether these were elaborate ciphers or simple inside jokes remains a mystery, but it highlights the human need to connect and protect information, even in the heat of war. And as you hold these tools, you realize they're more than mere objects, they're extensions of trust and camaraderie. Without them, the army would fall into disarray, each soldier a lone island in a sea of confusion. Your pack feels heavier now, but not just with weight. Loaded also with the invisible ties that bind a soldier to his unit and to those waiting far away. Evening settles in softly, like a quiet sigh, and you find yourself reflecting on the little comforts tucked inside your pack that help you hold on to sanity during long marches. Beyond rations and tools, soldiers carried items that might seem trivial but were vital for morale. A worn playing card deck, a handful of dice, or a simple musical instrument. Anything that could spark a laugh or provide distraction from the endless routine. You pull out a small flute, its wood smooth from years of use. Music was a universal language among soldiers, and even the faintest tune could lift spirits or soothe weary minds. The soft notes drift through the twilight, mingling with the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. It's a fragile thread connecting you to moments of peace amid the turmoil. Here's a quirky fact. Some soldiers carried small jars of ink and quills, not just for letters but to doodle or write poems. This act of creativity amid hardship feels like a quiet rebellion against the grim reality of war. Historians still argue whether such artistic outlets were common or reserved for officers and educated soldiers, but it's clear that expression was a lifeline for many. You also notice a patch of lavender tucked inside your coat, dried and fragrant. Aromatherapy wasn't exactly a formal practice back then, but scents like lavender and rosemary were believed to calm nerves and ward off illness. Whether by tradition or superstition, these small bundles of herbs were like portable peacekeepers. There's a fringe story about some soldiers carrying small carved animals or figures, tokens of luck passed down from home or crafted during long nights. These tiny guardians were more than superstition. They were reminders that even in the darkest times, hope and faith endure. As night deepens and the campfire flickers, you tuck these small treasures away with a sense of gratitude. They don't lighten your pack's weight much, but they ease the heaviness in your heart. Tomorrow's march will come soon enough, but for now, the quiet companionship of music, words, and scent offers a fragile kind of shelter. The night deepens into a gentle stillness, and as you settle down beneath the whispering trees, your thoughts turn to the enduring spirit packed alongside the tangible gear. The journey's end is nowhere in sight, yet the items you carry, each with its history, purpose, or story, forge a silent pact of resilience. A soldier's pack is more than a collection of tools. It's a mobile home, a sanctuary, and a testament to human endurance. You recall the buttons on your coat, those carefully chosen symbols of identity and pride. They connect you to a legacy of discipline and fashion, a strange blend of utility and vanity that somehow feels grounding amid uncertainty. The debate among historians about why Napoleon favored certain designs reminds you that even the smallest details carry weighty meaning, shaped by culture, personality, and the relentless march of time. Your pack, stuffed with hardtack, a bit of honey, a worn flute, and secret notes, tells stories beyond the battlefield. It speaks of hope, of laughter in the dark, and whispered prayers for safety. These items are silent witnesses to countless footsteps on dusty roads, to conversations under the stars, and to moments when courage flickered but did not fade. There's a soothing rhythm to the march now, a rhythm carried not just in your feet but in the legacy you bear. The scholarly debates, the quirky facts, and the lived experiences all blend into a tapestry of human complexity, reminding you that history is alive and breathing, even in its quietest corners. As your eyelids grow heavy and the night air cools around you, the weight of the journey feels less daunting. Each piece of your pack is a thread in the fabric of survival, weaving comfort and courage together. Now breathe deeply, feel the steady pulse of your heart, and let the quiet night cradle you. The road ahead will wait, but for now, rest is yours. The day's light fades gently as your mind slows, and you feel the softness of the earth beneath you. The sounds of distant crickets and a light breeze become a lullaby, blending with the fading warmth of the fire. You're wrapped not just in your cloak but in the stories carried by every item in your pack, every memory tied to the march. It's okay to let go now, to sink into the peace that comes with knowing you've done what you can. The march may continue tomorrow, but tonight you are safe, cradled by history and the quiet night. Sleep deeply, dream gently, and know that the journey continues, even in rest. Sweet dreams.